W.C. Fields, that name probably rings a bell for some of you. He was a comedian from a long time ago. His heyday was probably back in the 20s and the 30s, really. And he said a lot of funny things, I think. But he said, don't worry about... Am I on? Yeah, I am. He said, don't worry about your heart. It'll last you as long as you live. That's pretty sound medical advice there. In actuality, we do think about our hearts from a biological perspective, a medical perspective. We pay cardiologists good money to make sure our hearts are in good health, and rightly so. It's a matter of life and death. But Jesus actually talks about the heart. Jesus talks about heart disease. In our first passage we'll be looking at tonight, and we'll look at quite a few, Matthew 15, verses 19 and 20, Jesus discusses heart health. Matthew 15, verse 19. There he says, out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. Now, of course, when Jesus is referring to the heart, he's not talking about the blood-pumping function of the heart. At one time, now we consider the brain to be the seat of emotion and moral choices, but the ancients thought that that was what the heart did. And so when Jesus is referencing the heart, he's acknowledging that understanding. We still do today. We talk about somebody breaking our hearts. That's what we're talking about. So Jesus says the state of your heart in a spiritual sense then sets the course of your life, and it's therefore a really important matter. And he's not the only one in the Bible who says that sort of thing. Solomon, going back to Proverbs. In Proverbs 4, verse 23, Solomon says, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. And that's true for good or bad. Whether you go out and do good things or bad things, whatever you do, it all starts here. It all starts between your ears. Numerous studies, a large body of research says that the media we consume, video games, social networking sites, websites, TV shows, the music you listen to, the books you read, all of those things literally change the electrical wiring in your brain and have a dramatic impact on your behavior for good or for ill. And so the state of your heart is a critical matter. It can't be overstated. So we've got to protect our hearts, as Solomon says. He said, guard your heart, for from it flow the springs of life. And that water might be good water from those springs. It might be bitter water. But Solomon says, be mindful of that. And the psalmist in Psalm 119, verse 9, he poses a question and then answers it. And he says, how can a young man keep his way pure? Or could also be stated, how can a young man guard his heart? By guarding it according to your word, according to God's word. And so tonight, we're going to look at God's word, and we're going to take this psalmist's advice, and we're going to look at 45 ways that we can guard our hearts. No, actually just 8 ways. So that's how I can get you to, buy into an 8-point sermon there, right? Okay, 8 ways in which we can guard our hearts according to God's word. And the first thing I think is pretty clear, abundantly clear from God's word. We need to be wise about who we spend our time with, about who we develop friendships with. We need to seek godly companions. Solomon, again, in Proverbs 13, verse 20, makes it very clear that, and elsewhere, he makes it clear that poorly chosen companions will drag us down. In Solomon 13:20, not Solomon 13:20, there's no such book. Proverbs 13:20, a lot of times what I mean to say isn't what I say, and Crystal, I start noticing her and she helps me to correct that. Proverbs 13:20, Solomon says, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. And again in Proverbs 22, in verse 24, Solomon says, make no friendship with a man given to anger, nor go with a wrathful man, lest you learn his ways and entangle yourself in a snare. Jumping forward to Paul's letters to the Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, Paul says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? And again, a very often quoted, and rightly so, a very often quoted verse in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33, Paul says what we've all heard, do not be deceived, bad company corrupts or ruins good morals. Now, that's not to say that, remember, Jesus dined with sinners and tax collectors. Jesus didn't live in a monastery. He was out in the world. But Jesus, when it came to his set of close friends, that's a smaller group of people. He had friends like Mary and Martha and Lazarus that we know of, and he was on good terms with John the Baptist. He had his 12 apostles that he spent a lot of time with. He confided closely. He was more open and vulnerable with them. And of those 12, he had 3, Peter, James, and John, who he was with in his most intimate moments. So you don't hide from the world, but you're wise about who you choose as your close friends. And more than that, God in His wisdom doesn't throw us out in the world as Christians going solo. He puts us together in bodies of believers. And I think it's very clear why the writer of Hebrews says what he says. In Hebrews 10, verse 24, he says, don't forsake this assembling together. And there's a reason for that. Hebrews 10:24, the writer of Hebrews says, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. You want to keep your heart pure? Find your close friendships here in this group, in this body. Befriend people who will lift you up. Second way to guard our hearts and keep them healthy. Be wise about what you allow your senses to take in. Be wise about what you see. Be wise about what you hear. Be wise about what you experience. Now, here's something interesting about the brain. The brain is an amazing computer with an amazing amount of memory. The Library of Congress holds somewhere around 24 million volumes. And that's about, neurologists tell us that's about the capacity that our brain has. We may not go out and read that much, but theoretically, we have the potential to store that vast sum of information. And that's a good thing, but it's also a bit of an ominous thing, because once you get something in there, once you experience something, once you take in images and knowledge, that information doesn't decay over time. It's simply filed, it's put back in the filing cabinet somewhere, but it's still in there. Once impure and unwholesome ideas and thoughts and images get into your brain, they're very hard to remove. And so that's why I believe Paul says in Romans 16, verse 19, he tells us to be selective about what we take in. Romans 16, 19, Paul says this. He says, I want you to be wise about what is good. Seek out good messages, information. Take it in. And I want you to be innocent about what is evil. Filter out all this trash that's around us. And I'll grant you that's a hard thing to do. That's probably as hard to do today as it ever has been. There's a world of impurity that I could pull up right now just with this little thing right here. There's impure images and impure data, and information is more accessible than it's ever been. And so we've got to be very disciplined. We've got to be very vigilant about what we take into our brains. To keep your heart pure, be wise about where you go. Be wise about the places that you're at. You know, there are some places where trouble is lurking. There are some. Lot, he made a bad bargain. He chose to go into the well-watered Jordan Valley where the grass was green because he knew that he would have bigger flocks and herds, which were the wealth of that time, 4,000 years ago. Of course, he was also going into the place where he also was going down to live in the land of Sodom, one of the most corrupt places that the world has ever seen. And you know, that didn't work out very well. His flocks probably did pretty well. His family didn't fare nearly as well. When when two angels came down to warn Lot that God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities of the plain, Lot went to warn his sons-in-law, but they wouldn't have any of it. In Genesis 19, verse 14, Lot went and he said to his sons-in-law who were to marry his daughters, "Get up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. Get out of here. That's not going to happen. They were pretty entrenched. They were just fine where they were. Couldn't get them out. They were destroyed along with the city. Lot's wife, Genesis 19, verse 26, God said, "Get out of here and don't look back." Of course, she looked back, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. Lot survived. He escaped. His daughters escaped with him, but it seems even they had been tainted by their time there because their husbands-to-be were killed in the destruction of the city, and they saw it as a suitable solution to get their father drunk and commit incest with him in order to have children. They'd been tainted by their time there too. Be wise about where you go. Now, granted, Jesus tells us in Matthew 28, He gives us the Great Commission, and He says, "Go unto all the world and spread the gospel as you go," essentially. But we got to be careful when we got to ask ourselves, why are we going where we're going? What is our intention and what is our purpose? And we've also got to acknowledge this. If my weakness is alcohol, if I struggle with alcoholism, I probably don't need to be going to a tavern to try to set up Bible studies. There's probably someone else who's better suited for that, right? And that brings us to the next point. To keep your heart pure, be ready to run from evil. Be ready to run from temptation. When you see something that can corrupt your heart, the Bible, Paul says, flee from it. In 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18, Paul tells us to flee from sexual immorality. That's a temptation. That's a powerful temptation. You don't want to dabble with it. 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee from sexual immorality. Elsewhere, he'll use the same wording. He'll tell us to flee from youthful passions. He'll tell us to flee from idolatry. He'll tell us to flee from the love of money. If you remember, Jesus, when He was tempted in the wilderness by Satan, and granted, He was tempted. These things did look appealing to Him, but what did Satan tempt Him with? Tempted Him with worldly power, tempted Him with the idea of being the greatest king probably that the world has ever seen. And you remember when Jesus fed a multitude, thousands of people, what did they want to do? They wanted to make Him a king by force. And if that idea of worldly power was a temptation to Him once, who's to say that it wasn't a temptation again? But you know what Jesus did? He saw they wanted to make Him a king. He left. I believe there were times Jesus lived sinlessly, and I believe He knew when to leave a temptation behind and get away from it. Flee temptations. And realize this, God will always give us a way out. We're given that promise in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13. We know that God, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, we know that God will always give us a way of escape from temptation. And we need to be ready to take it. To guard your heart, be wise about what you think. Be wise about what goes on in here, between your ears. In 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5, Paul says that he takes every thought captive to obey Christ. And you may think, well, how can you control your thoughts? But it is possible. It just takes some strategy. You don't want to let your mind wander to dark, negative places. And you can do that. But, again, there's some strategy involved. In Psalm 119, verses 14 through 16, here's what the psalmist says. He says, "In the way of your testimonies, I delight as much as in all riches. I will meditate on your precepts and fix my eyes on your ways. I will delight in your statutes. I will not forget your word." And indeed, I think when he says, "I will not forget your word," there's a lot to that, because someone in that time period, a Hebrew, a Jew, an Israelite of that time period, in his education, he would have largely memorized the Old Testament, depending on how far he went in his education. If you didn't go as far as others, you might have memorized just the first 5 books of the New Testament. If you went farther, you might have all of it memorized. It depended, or at least all of it that existed given your point in time. But the point is, he had it in there. He could lie in his bed at night, and he could, when you learn something, what can you do? You've had experiences, you can mull over them. You can turn them over in your mind. You can view them from different angles. And that's what he's talking about when he says, I will meditate on your precepts. Put good things into your brain and then dwell on them. Think about them. That's what Paul says, Philippians 4, verse 8. Philippians 4, verse 8. Paul says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, what does he say? He says, think about these things. If you're busy thinking about good stuff, you know what it's hard to do? Unless your brain is double-jointed and it's hard to think about the bad stuff and the good stuff at the same time. Most of us can't do that, thank goodness. Be wise to keep your heart pure. Don't just be wise about what you think. Be wise about what you let your mouth do. Be wise about what you say. There are times, Crystal can tell you, that the later the day gets and the tireder I get, the more morbid I get. And after a while, sometimes I'll give into temptation to grumble and gripe and talk about how bad everything is. And I bring Crystal down when I do that, but I also bring myself down. The funny thing about it is when you give voice to a thought, whether it's a good thought or a bad thought, you intensify it. You feel it more. If I will force myself to say something good, I start to feel something good. Paul Faulkner said it's easier to act yourself into a better way of feeling than it is to feel yourself into a better way of acting. So be deliberate about saying good things, and not only will you lift up the people around you, but you lift yourself up. James 1 verse 26 James 1:26, James talks about the importance of keeping your mouth under control and controlling what you say. He says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Colossians 4, verses 6 through 7. Colossians 4, verses 6 through 7. Paul tells us, he counsels us, he says that we need to keep our conversation filled with grace always. He says we need to keep our words seasoned with salt so that we may always know how to answer everyone. Essentially, that's what he's saying. And so it is possible to be wise about what we say, and it makes a huge difference to us and those around us. We need to be wise about what we do. We need to be wise as we seek to guard our hearts. We need to be wise about what we do. We need to busy our hands with good, wholesome, productive work. The Sabbath was a commandment that God was quite adamant about. And if people deliberately forsook the Sabbath, they could actually be killed for that in the Old Testament. But it's also important to note that God prescribed 1 day of rest, but He also prescribed 6 days of work. It's true that idle hands are the devil's workshop. We need to roll up our sleeves, busy ourselves doing good things. Teddy Roosevelt said one of the greatest gifts that life has to give is the opportunity to work hard at work worth doing. And that's very true. Paul tells the Ephesian Christians, he says in Ephesians 4:28, he says, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Titus 3 verse 8, he said, now in Titus 3 verse 8 is where we're going next, but Titus was preaching, he was teaching on the island of Crete, and the Cretans did not have a very good work ethic. They were known as being kind of lazy people, and so here's what Paul told Titus to tell the Cretans. He said, this saying is trustworthy, and I want you to insist on these things so that those who have believed in God may be careful to devote themselves to good works. These things are excellent and profitable for everyone. We want to have a healthy heart. We need to be ready every day to roll up our sleeves and hit it, doing good work. That doesn't mean we're workaholics and that we neglect our families, but neither are we lazy. And like I said, that kind of a life is very fulfilling. Solomon tells us that. In Ecclesiastes 5:19, Solomon says, to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God, for he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. And there's yet another bonus of learning how to work hard. Not only do you keep your mind on the good things that your hands are doing, you help to protect your heart, but you sleep well at night. Ecclesiastes 5 verse 12, Ecclesiastes 5:12, Solomon says, sweet is the sleep of the laborer, whether he eats little or much. Crystal and I, after moving, we kind of hibernated. We can vouch for that. And finally, granted, we want to protect our hearts. Nobody has a perfect heart. We've all sinned. We've all allowed some corruption to seep into our hearts. But the good news is our God is a gifted cardiologist, and He can help us overcome that damage. He can create a clean heart within us. And so my eighth suggestion for keeping your heart clean, guarding your heart, ask God to create a clean heart in you. You remember David, what was he known as? He was known as a man after God's own heart. But you know, he had some shortcomings, and he had some less than honorable moments in his life. He fell into sin with Bathsheba, and one sin led to another, and he wound up having Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite, killed in order to cover up his sin. But Nathan the prophet came to him and confronted David with his sin, and David was cut to the heart. And in Psalm 51, verse 10, he said, he prayed to God. He said, create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. And the interesting thing, if you jump forward to Stephen's message shortly before he was stoned, in Acts 13:22, Stephen is still referring to David as what? 1,000 years later, 1,000 years after the incident with Bathsheba, Stephen is still referring to David as a man after God's own heart in Acts 13:22. And that's who we know him as today. I think it's abundantly clear. David said, please create a clean heart within me, and that's just what God did. And you know, none of us, we've all got some things that we're ashamed of. We've all fallen short, but I doubt any of us have fallen as much as David fell. And God created a pure heart within him, and God can create a pure heart within us. We just need to ask Him, and we just need to go to the source, and we need to seek out the healing and allow that healing to come. Guard your heart. Keep it pure. And that's largely a matter of putting in the good to keep out the bad, as we've seen tonight. You know, if you've got an abscessed tooth, you go to the dentist, and what does he do? He goes in and he cleans out the decay and he cleans out the corruption, but he doesn't leave a gaping void in that tooth, does he? Because you'd go home and that infection would return and be worse than ever. What does he do? He puts in a gold filling, or whatever the material might be. He puts in something good to keep out the bad. In Matthew 12 verse 43, Jesus describes, he gives a very interesting parable, a very interesting metaphor. He talks about a man from whom an unclean spirit has been driven out. And that unclean spirit goes into arid places seeking rest, and he finds none. And he says, I'll go back to the house I came from. And he comes back to that man, and he sees the house empty, swept clean, and put in order. And what does he do? He brings 7 other impure spirits worse than himself, and the last state of that man is worse than the first. And that's to say that if you don't have God's goodness within you, you are defenseless against that corruption. And so what does that mean? Again, touching on what we've said, we need to fill our mouths with good words. We need to fill our lives with good friends. We need to fill our brains with good ideas and good messages. We need to fill our time with good work. we need to ask God to create a clean heart within us. And it's important to remember that I look at you and all I see your faces. I see the clothes you wear, but it's important to remember that when God looks at you, what does He look at? He looks at your heart. That's right. In 1 Samuel 6, verse 17, 1 Samuel 16, 7. There we go, that's better. 1 Samuel 16, 7, we read that the Lord sees not as a man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on your heart, on the heart. Your life, again, going back to our earlier passages, your life is a spring that flows from your heart. Proverbs 4, verse 23, and that water will either be sweet or it will be bitter. But tonight, if you are struggling, if the state of your heart isn't what it needs to be, realize that healing is possible. Healing is available. And God can, there's no prayer that God can't answer. And often He will use us as His instruments, His willing servants. So tonight, if we can encourage you, if we can help you get back on the right path, if your heart isn't where you want it to be, whatever your need might be tonight, we ask you to come forward as we stand and sing this invitation song.